Hey guys, welcome back for the second part of my building destruction tutorial. If you've missed the first part, or like me, you've got a really bad memory, this is the effect we're trying to create. So they're all going to be here, right here in Melbourne. What the hell? Holy crap. Obviously, this being the second part of my building destruction tutorial, I will assume that you watched part 1. If you haven't yet, you can check it out right here. In the first part, I showed you how to track your footage, add a building into the scene and then add some explosions onto that building. In part 2, I will show you how to refine your effect and add some debris, smoke and the actual lighting for the explosions to bind it all together into a really cool looking building destruction effect. As with the previous part, I will assume that you are fairly comfortable using After Effects, that you know how to use 3D layers, mattes, masks and compositions. If you're still a little bit unsure on those things, do check out some of the beginner or intermediate tutorials that I do have on my channel. But enough talking, let's jump right into the tutorial. Here's where we got up to in part 1 of this tutorial. We have the building added into the scene, as well as 2 separate explosions being triggered off on that building. And if your memory serves you well, you will remember the building comp we set up that contained the actual building and the explosion elements. Now let's start adding the detail to the destruction effect, starting with the debris. All you need for this is a picture of some concrete or rock or any other surface that suits a piece of your building breaking off. I have a simple white concrete texture here. Don't worry if the color doesn't match perfectly yet, we'll fix that up later with some curves adjustments. Drop this image on the Create New Composition icon to create a new composition. This new composition now only contains our concrete picture. Now take the masking tool and cut out a rough fragment of the concrete. Keep the mask nice and jagged so it looks like the piece could have just broken off the building. Center this fragment in the middle of your composition and open up the composition settings. You want to tweak the width and height so that there isn't quite as much empty space around your concrete piece. I'm just going to reduce the width a little bit. Since I'm a neat freak, I will rename this composition to Concrete Particle Comp and, like any composition, drop it into my pre-comps folder in the project window. Now return to your building comp. We will set up a particle system to emit random pieces of concrete at the position of the explosions to make it look like the pieces of debris are being torn off from the building. For this, create a new solid. The color is totally irrelevant. I just like to keep mine either white or black unless I use the actual color of the solid. Rename the solid to debris particles. Also make sure the resolution of this layer matches your composition. Since my composition is 1080p Full HD, I will also set this solid to be 1920 by 1080. Then hit OK. Now search for the CC Particle World effect in your Effects and Presets panel and apply it to the new solid. Under normal circumstances, I'd probably use the Particular plugin as it offers many more advanced features that can enhance your particle effect, but since it's a paid plugin, I'm going to go with the CC Particle World as it comes with After Effects by default. Go to the CC Particle World effect and open up the producer settings. We want to move the producer to the exact location where the explosions are hitting the building. Since the building is quite far away from the camera, we also want to push the producer far away, so increase the position V property to something pretty large. Just a quick tip, hold down the Shift key while dragging on a property to change their values much faster. I will set my Z position to around 30, then tweak the X and Y parameters to place the emitter right in the middle of the first explosion. Of course, these parameters will very much depend on the scene that you're actually working with. Just make sure the emitter is positioned correctly to emit the debris particles. Yep, that looks good. Now hop over to your project window and drag the concrete particle comp we created into your composition. I'm going to drop it at the very bottom, but it doesn't matter where you add it since the next step is to disable the visibility on it. We will use this layer as the texture for our particles, and for that, the source layer itself does not need to be visible. Go back to the CC Particle World settings. Actually, I think I'll push the emitter a bit further away still. I just want the emitter to be far enough away from the camera so that the speed of the falling particles matches the speed you'd expect to see from chunks of concrete at that distance. Feel free to tweak this as you please. I will set it to around 100 for now. And again, I will tweak the X and Y position of the emitter to place it right on top of the explosion. Next, you want to increase the radius X property of the producer because the explosion strikes along the entire side of the building and therefore we want debris to be raining down along this line of destruction and not just from a single point. Make sure the line is nicely positioned along the same line as your explosions. Okay, enough tweaking, let's finally style our particles. Open the Particle tab and change the particle type to Textured Quad Polygon. Then expand the Texture tab just below that and select our concrete particle comb as the texture layer. This will assign our concrete layer to be used as the texture for every particle emitted. Now, you still can't see any particles, but don't panic, they're simply too small and too far away to be visible. To fix that, simply increase the birth and death size as appropriate until your chunky concrete particles are nice and visible. About 10 seems to work fine. Let's zoom in on this magic a little bit more. You may notice that the particles are not falling very far. That is because their lifetime, the longevity, is set to 1 second. This setting is at the very top of the CC particle world effect parameters. Set the longevity to something that is long enough for the particles to fall down and out of view behind the skyline mat we set up. Yep, 10 seconds seems to be enough for this scene. I do find the chunks a little bit too large though, so I will lower their size to something like 6. Increase the size variation to 100% to ensure that the concrete particle size is a bit more random. Now that I'm looking at it, let's make the chunks even smaller. Also, since concrete is generally not very transparent, I will set the max opacity property to 100. Cool, that's much better. Scrub through your footage and you can enjoy an endless stream of debris. Of course, that's not what we want. We want the debris to be emitted only when the explosions strike. We can achieve this simply by animating the birth rate on the CC particle world effect. Go to the time when the first explosion strikes, click on the stopwatch icon next to the birth rate and change it to 0. Then move forward a few frames until the explosion is fully visible and jack up the birth rate to something like 5. Again, move forward a few more frames and set the birth rate back to 0. A small burst of debris particles is now emitted at the exact moment of the first explosion. I think I will tweak this a tiny bit. For one, I want the debris to be emitted from a slightly larger area on the building side, so I will increase the radius Y property of the producer. Just reposition it as needed. And I will also increase the velocity with which the particles are emitted. After all, the concrete pieces are flung out into the sky by the explosions and should have some momentum to them. Let's check out what this looks like. Much better. But still I think the concrete pieces are a tad too big, so I will, once again, make them a little bit smaller. Get used to that. Creating visual effects is a lot about iterations until it looks just right. Okay, sorry for that one. Yep, I'm happy with that debris effect. Now let's create the debris for the second explosion. Simply go to a time after the first explosion has ended and enable keyframes on the position Y property of the producer. Move forward a few frames until the debris for the second explosion should occur and alter the Y position so that the producer now sits nicely over the second explosion. You can reveal all keyframes for the selected layer by pressing U on your keyboard. Animate the birth rate again to rise from 0 to around 5 and then back to 0 just as the second explosion strikes. This will cause debris to be emitted at the position of the second explosion just as it hits. Play back your footage to check out the debris effect. Pretty sweet. The concrete chunks are a little bit too bright to fit into the scene, so as with almost everything, let's apply a curves effect to the debris particles layer. Decrease the brightness until the particles look like they may actually have come off the building. Also, don't forget to go over to the blue channel and push it up a little bit, as almost everything you film that is far away from the camera will have a slight bluish tint. Looks great! Now let's add the dust into the scene. We are going to follow almost the exact same process to set up a second particle system that will emit the smoke particles. I have some smoke stock footage here from the Actions Essentials 2 package. Check out footagecrate.com or detonationfilms.com for some free stock footage if you don't have Action Essentials. I will put a few links in the description of this video. Drag the dust stock footage onto the Create New Composition icon. As before, use the pen tool to create a mask to cut out a roundish piece from the middle of the layer. This time, since smoke is a much softer element than cold, hard concrete, expand the mask properties and increase the feather until the dust piece has a nice soft edge. You can apply all sorts of color effects to your smoke element here. For this tutorial, I will simply go with a simple gray smoke. For this, apply a hue and saturation effect to your layer and bring down the master saturation to drain the smoke of any color that may be left in it. I will also increase the lightness because I want my smoke to stand out a little bit better. Cool, that should do. Open the composition settings. Trim out any empty space by adjusting the width and height properties. Make sure the smoke element sits nicely in the center of your new composition and then return to the building comp. In my project window, I will call this new composition we just created Dust Particle Comp, and you guessed it, drop it into the Precomps folder. Drag the Dust Particle Comp into your composition and disable the visibility on it. Okay, there is one thing that I did miss in the last part of my tutorial, and thank you very much for pointing that out. Do you remember how I enabled motion blur on the building image so it would fit better into the scene when the camera was moving very fast? Sure you do. Of course, you also want to enable motion blur for all the other layers like the explosions, the debris, the smoke and any other layers you may decide to add. Okay, but now to the smoke. Create a new solid and call it Dust Particles. Apply the CC Particle World effect to it. Hop over to the particle effect settings and, first things first, reposition the producer to the foot of the building. Don't forget to push it to the same Z position as you did with the producer for the debris particles, which for me was around 100. Then tweak the X and Y position so it sits nicely at the base of your building. Increase the radius X property so that again the producer looks like a line along the entire side of the building. Now let's animate the birth rate. We want the smoke to start being emitted as the building begins to sink, increased at the final stages of collapse and then slowly fade away. So go to a time position where your building is still standing, enable keyframes on the birth rate property and set it to 0. Also, I want the smoke to start being emitted from a larger and larger area around the collapsing building, so also click the stopwatch icon for the radius X property. Move forward to a time when the building is starting to sink and increase the birth rate to something like 10. Again, this will of course depend on what effect you are going for and the footage you're working with, but simply create a few more keyframes to control how many particles are being emitted, and just as the building is about to finish the collapse, add one keyframe with a very large birth rate value. Then create one last keyframe and set the birth rate back to 0. Move back a little bit until the building has almost vanished and increase the radius X property of the producer. This will cause the producer to expand horizontally as the building collapses, making it seem like the smoke is spreading throughout the city. Of course, you need a little bit of imagination still, as the particles really do not look very much like smoke at this point. Also, notice that the particles do not stick around for very long. You'd expect smoke to stay around a little bit longer, so let's double the longevity of these particles. Yep, I'd say that's a little bit better. But in order to tell what it'll actually look like, let's change our particle type to the smoke element we created. Open the particle settings and, as before, change the particle type to textured quad polygon. For the texture, select our dust particle comp. And now, since our dust particle comp is actually animated, this is important. Set the texture time to birth. This will cause each new particle to start the full dust animation when it is being spawned. And again, we can't see our particles simply because they are too small and too far away. So go back and increase your birth and death size. I actually want my smoke particles to slowly expand over time, so I will set them to 10 and 35 respectively. Also increase the size variation to around 100% to make the smoke look a little bit less uniform. Scrub through your footage and you can slowly see the smoke taking shape, but it is being emitted in the wrong direction, downwards. We will fix that up in a moment, but one other setting we should change first is the rotation speed. We do not want our smoke particles to rotate around some random axis, but stay facing the camera and move smoothly. So set the rotation speed to 0 and set the rotation axis to Z. Your smoke should immediately appear to be thicker because now all particles are facing the camera. Now open the Physics tab. Change the animation to viscose. Next, since we want the smoke to slowly drift upwards rather than fall down, set the gravity to -0.1. Yep, that looks a lot better already, but still the smoke does not spread out enough. Let's jack up the velocity of the particles to around 7 so the smoke is spawned with a bit more power. In order to not have the particles fly off into the distance, you can bring up the resistance property to slow the smoke down after it has been emitted. Actually, let's increase the velocity some more to maybe 10 or so. Let's preview what we've got so far. Not bad, but I think we could do with a bigger burst of smoke towards the end of the building collapse. So I will quickly shift the last few keyframes, create a new keyframe and set the birth rate even higher before it drops back to 0. Again, this all comes down to tweaking until you are happy with your effect. I'm quite happy with this smoke. Note that you can control the thickness of the smoke particles very easily by changing the max opacity setting in the CC particle world effect. You can also easily spread your smoke out more by increasing the radius X property of your producer. Looking good. Let's jump back to the parent composition to check out the effect we have so far. Yep, indeed, looking pretty good, I'd say. Actually, I might move the smoke just a little bit higher up so it's a little bit more visible above the edge of the other city buildings. I will also not forget to enable the motion blur on the dust particles layer. Now we're finally ready to add the very last element, the explosion lighting. I'm just going to disable adaptive resolution so that the preview window doesn't revert to low resolution while scrubbing through the composition. Go to the time where the first explosion strikes. Duplicate the tracking solid, move the copy to the very top of your composition and rename it to Lighting Matte. We will use this layer to define the areas of our footage that will receive lighting from the explosions. Enable the visibility on the Lighting Matte layer and reduce the opacity until it is just slightly visible. Select the ellipse tool and draw a large mask centered around the area of the explosion. Open up the mask properties and increase the mask feather to blur the edge of the green ellipse. I will just increase the opacity of this layer a little bit just so it's a bit more visible in this tutorial. Now select the pen tool and, similar to what we did for the skyline matte, draw a mask around the buildings that you want to sit in front of the explosion lighting. This time, however, you do not have to be as precise because intense light tends to spill over the edges of elements anyways. I will speed this up a little bit just so you don't get bored. When you close the mask, you will notice that the buildings are overlaid by the green solid. Remember that everything that is green will end up receiving light, and we do not want these buildings to be illuminated by the explosions. So go over to your mask and set the mask mode to subtract. This will cut the mask shape out of the lighting matte layer. As before, increase the mask feather a little bit just to blur out the edge of this mask. This looks pretty good already, but if we zoom in, we can see that the green from the lighting matte is spilling onto the sky behind the buildings. Since we don't want the sky to be illuminated by the explosions either, select the pen tool again and draw another mask, this time around the sky behind the buildings of your city. Here's a neat trick for you. Because the lighting matte layer has a number of masks on it already, we might get into trouble when trying to add yet another mask. The points we are trying to add sometimes do get added to the wrong mask. You can avoid this problem by locking down the masks on the layer. You can do this by clicking on the little lock icon next to the mask's name. Now draw the mask around your sky. Again, this is sped up, I'm not actually that fast. Give the mask plenty of space above the building since we are working with a moving shot. Set the mask mode to subtract and increase the mask feather. Cool, that looks pretty good. The green sheen clearly defines where we will see the explosion lighting. Since the second explosion strikes higher up on the building than the first, let's animate the big ellipse mask to move upwards for the second detonation. Don't forget to unlock your masks if you want to work with them again. While locked, you can neither edit nor select them. I will lock down the sky mask instead so it doesn't get in the way. Click the stopwatch next to the mask path property for the big ellipse mask to create a keyframe. Move forward in time to the moment between the two explosions and insert a copy of the first keyframe. You can do this using the Ctrl+C and Ctrl+V keys. Actually, the second keyframe should be just before the second explosion strikes. We want the mask to be in the upper position already when the second detonation hits. Make sure you are one frame ahead of the second keyframe and move the ellipse mask upwards to position it nicely over the second set of fireballs. I think it could be a little bit higher still. Scrub through your footage to make sure that this mask moves correctly to sit right on top of both explosions. This seems to be good. Let's play this back one more time to ensure that everything is working as expected. Nice! Now go to the time just before the first explosion strikes and reveal the opacity property for the lighting matte. Enable keyframes on the opacity and set the value to 0. Move forward a few frames until the first explosion is fully visible and jack up the opacity to 100%. Move through your explosion and add keyframes as needed. Just ensure that when the explosion ends, you animate the opacity back to 0. Repeat the same process for the second explosion. Scrub through your footage to make sure the lighting matte becomes visible exactly in time with the two explosions. Now let's finally create the actual lighting. Select the building comp layer and duplicate it. I'm going to call this layer Lighting. Make sure the lighting layer sits directly below the lighting mat and then set the track mat to alpha inverted. Also change the blend mode on this layer to Add. Something didn't go right. If we scrub through our footage, the entire building seems to be brightly lit and the animated lighting mat does not seem to have any effect whatsoever. Figured it out yet? Well, one thing we want to do is actually change the track mat mode on the lighting layer. Because our lighting mat is visible wherever we expect to see the lighting, we need to set the track mat mode on the lighting layer to alpha matte. Also, let's disable the visibility on the lighting mat layer as we don't need to see it anymore. Scrubbing through your footage, the building should be illuminated in time with the explosions, and indeed it is. However, the background footage which contains all of our other buildings is not. Solo out the lighting layer to see which parts are illuminated. Yup, it is just the building. Unsolo the lighting layer again. Do note that the base footage in this composition is actually marked as a guide layer. If this is not the case for you, make sure you mark this layer as a guide layer now. The actual reason the background footage is not illuminated as part of the lighting layer is because in the underlying composition we also mark the background footage as a guide layer. Go into the building comp, select the footage layer and disable the guide layer flag. Return to your parent composition and solo out the lighting layer again to see which parts of the footage are now being illuminated. This looks much more like what we want. The building, the explosions and the background footage are receiving lighting. Unsolo the layer again and go back to the beginning of your composition. Let's preview the effect we have created. This looks pretty decent. Let's just make two small tweaks to make this look a little bit more realistic. For one, the lighting is much too bright. Select the lighting layer, reveal the opacity property and decrease it to something around 70. We also want to tint this lighting layer a little bit yellow to match better with the explosions. For this, search for the curves effect in the Effects and Presets panel and apply it to the lighting layer. Go into the red color channel and bump it up a fair bit. Then hop over to the green color channel and increase it as well. This will tint the lighting effect nice and yellow to match up with the color of the explosions. The lighting still seems a little bit too bright, so let's lower it to around 50%. And we're finally done. Go to the beginning of your composition and play back your final building destruction effect. And that's all folks, I really hope you enjoyed this tutorial. As always, please leave any comments, questions or suggestions in the section below. If you would like to show some support, please subscribe, hit that like button, share the video around. It really helps out a lot with the channel, and as always, you can always find and follow me on Facebook or Twitter. Until next time, I will see you later.